So just for context, for people who are listening, the main reason that me and Frederick got into contact was because he and Ingrid, who are good friends, continued the conversation from the Song Like interview about Nordic folk music. And this is the best outcome I could have hoped for, because that conversation started more conversations and more conversations. And to me, that's the ideal. Like, that's what I do this for. So, when I heard that this conversation was being continued in private spaces after that interview, um, and not only that, but the person who did the Trollstemt documentary had some things to say about it, I was like, okay, this is a dream come true. So you were introduced to the conversation that I had with Maria and Ingrid, and now I think that it would just be a great time to just have the conversation. Now, just some ground rules for it is I will not censor you at all. Like, at no point will I be like, well, actually, that's not what I do. So instead, I would just love for you to sort of chime in with especially with your experience in doing Trollstemt. When we talk about Nordic folk music and we have that friction between, there's already a Nordic folk music that has a tradition, has the heritage and all of that, but now there's this new thing popping up over in this corner, also calling itself Nordic folk music. I would just give the mic to you, wherever you want to start with that question of what is Nordic folk music. I know it's a massive question, or if we can point it more,
Yeah,
what is your take on this Nordic folk music and this Nordic folk music?
yeah, for sure. No, we actually ended Trollstemp by asking all the people that we talked to during the show, what is Norwegian folk music?
Mm-hmm.
And they started putting their head in their hands and saying, "Oh my, oh, I have no idea."
Mm-hmm.
And these are people who have been playing folk music for 50 years, some of them. So,
Yep.
so it seems like it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint exactly what is Norwegian folk music. The way it sort of has been presented is that it's an oral tradition, or it's a
Mm-hmm.
master pupil tradition, so that
Mm-hmm.
like with these two girls I mentioned earlier, that they were playing a tradition that had been known in that area since the 1700s, or
Mm-hmm.
even before. So it's sort of that it has this sort of traditional way of learning by looking at the teacher, or the master, or whatever word
Mm-hmm.
you would use for it. So that sort of has been a mainstay in the what is Norwegian folk music, has been that it's an oral tradition. It's an unbroken line from father to son to mother to daughter to grandparents to
Mm-hmm.
so it's been called an unbroken line.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, for example, if you look at the using sort of Viking era instruments,
Mm-hmm.
that has sort of jumped, from the thousands or 900s
Mm-hmm.
all the way up until, quite a lot of them have been black metal artists, or sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
pagans that have sort of started using bone flutes, and
Mm-hmm.
these old harps and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff, and sort of integrating that into often sort of metal sound, or at
Mm-hmm.
least more modern sort of instrumentation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the main sort of differentiation you make is that one has an unbroken line,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one has inspiration from using instruments, but that it's a new way of interpreting
Mm-hmm.
really old sort of pagan music.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think that would be the main sort of difference between what you would call the sort of Vikings
Mm-hmm.
inspired, and the sort of more traditional folk music, if you could put it like that.
Yeah, I mean that's where I start with it too, honestly. It's because folk music is more than the instruments you use. If I were the example I always use is, if I were to go out and buy a sitar and start just writing music on it, being a sitar doesn't make the music Indian, you know?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that is the first thing that I see happen, right? Is someone picks up a Kraviklir because they see Einar play it in Varjuna, and they say this must be Norwegian folk since I'm playing it on this instrument. Um, and without answering that question, that's at least the perspective that is
Mm.
had. And the other one is lineage. If you look to what folk music has been defined as since the philosopher Herder
Mm.
made up the name folk song, folk music, um, the defining element of it has always been it comes from a tradition. It
Yeah,
it it doesn't mean that it has to stay the same over centuries, but there has to be that oral tradition, that line that it follows down, right?
for
And
sure.
so in the Norwegian context, um, some people might chuckle if you call it an unbroken line, because of just how much things do change over time. But the
Mm.
point is still there that the songs and the fiddle tunes all learn from a long heritage, which I see where the name seems appealing from a bureaucratic point of view.
Mm.
That it is a heritage, right? And then
Yeah.
if you compare that defining element of it to someone who just picks up a Kraviklir and starts writing their own music, it's not folk music in its definition of what folk music is.
Mm.
Because even if it's on an instrument that goes to is from Norway, it doesn't come from the tradition at all if you're writing your own original music on it. And
Mm.
but where this misconception comes from is what me and Ingrid and Maria actually got into. And that is a general misconception that folk music means it's acoustic,
Yeah.
where that has, and America is to blame for that. Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
I love Bob Dylan. He's one of the greatest artists from America that has ever lived. But the changing of definition of folk in America to just mean anything acoustic has now complicated things, where someone will I'll be at a Vardruna concert and I will hear someone when he sings Helvegen,
Mm.
someone will go, "This is such a beautiful Norwegian folk song," and I'm sitting here like, I think he wrote this originally. Like, I don't think this is a folk song. He wrote this for the series, and but then that's the thing where I will never be the one to turn around and say actually, because what I'm fascinated by is how people come to that conclusion, right? How
Yeah.
people come to the conclusion that they hear Helvegen and they think it's a Norwegian folk song, right?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
but it does become a bit of a gray area with Einar because of how much he does interact with folk musicians. So
Yeah.
that answer isn't actually clean cut. It gets more interesting with Heilung when you
Yeah.
consider that Heilung is not even acoustic, but there's that dimension of folk that means authentic too,
Yeah.
where if something is authentic, then it's folk music, right? So I don't know. Now I've done quite a bit of talking, so that's where I come from
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
very
yeah. No,
least. So
no,
I would,
and
yeah,
it's true. And in Norway, it's such a small sort of culture that is competing with, America and England and all these really sort of
yep,
strong cultural sort of juggernauts.
mm-hmm,
So it's very clear that there is some sort of an importance of sort of listening to the sort of Norwegian instruments and
mm-hmm,
feeling that it's sort of the sound of us.
mm-hmm,
And that's the big us. So it's not like it's ethnically or
yeah,
it's
yeah,
religious or anything, but it's sort of the sound of Norway with the fjords and the mountains and the forests. And it's sort of, there's something about it that sort of speaks to you,
mm-hmm,
not in an intellectual level, but in to the heart.
yep,
Uh, uh, and I heard now a Norwegian hardanger fiddle player who did Vivaldi, the
yeah,
Italian Hemsing,
yeah, Ragnhild Hemsing, yeah, yeah.
Hemsing.
It was a beautiful
Yeah,
album. I loved that. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. I listened to it, I was talking to my wife, and we were talking about, suddenly Vivaldi sounds Norwegian. You know what I mean? Like there is
yeah,
something something about the sound that
Hmm.
you've heard, the spring, the four seasons
Hmm.
in a number of different sort of versions, but using the hardanger fiddle, it suddenly sounds like it's something that speaks to the heart
Yeah.
in a way. So it's sort of, if I'm to bring back this idea that film is feeling, music, of course,
Hmm.
even to a stronger degree,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
speaking to the feelings. So it's, and when you come to the sort of the feelings, it's difficult to sort of intellectualize it fully, if you know what I mean. Like
100%.
it's but yeah, I still think that the main sort of differentiation has been this heritage idea,
Hmm.
with Norwegian, the traditional folk music. And
Yep.
there's also been all this strange uh, infighting, because the accordion came to Norway
Yeah, the
in
Gameldans.
the Gameldans, and they hated the Norwegian traditionalist folk music.
Yep.
And there is a story from the late 1800s,
Hmm.
where a fiddler was playing at a dance, and you had this guy who had bought this really simple accordion, and he said, "Hey man, if could I try like a minute of this in the break?" And he said, "Yeah, for sure." And the fiddler went outside, and he played this 1.5 minutes on the accordion. And they locked the door, and they kept the fiddler out, and they just wanted him to do this minute and a half for the rest of the night, because it had this, new sound, and it was easier to dance to. And
Yep.
it's so the accordion and the hardanger fiddle has been sort of infighting,
Yep.
extremely hard fights.
Hmm.
And even the folk music milieu
Hmm.
split into two even in the 1980s,
Hmm.
because of the accordion,
Yep.
because the traditionalists didn't want the accordion to be sort of have a major part of the scene, in a way.
Yep.
So it's people get very emotional about sort of this,
Yep.
that this is not high culture, and the accordion is not high culture. It's not,
Hmm.
the learned complexities of generations of playing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so I don't know if I'm answering your question now, but for sure has been this quite rigid idea
Hmm.
that you have to, and mainly it's been the hardanger fiddle. You also
Hmm.
had something called the langeleik, and you've had some
Yeah, yeah.
harps. So there are other instruments as well, but sort of the hardanger fiddle has sort of taken the main stage in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
traditional folk music environment, especially.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that sort of, and so the idea of the series as well, and what Gangar has done, and Kenneth, and all these sort of newer, is to sort of break with this idea that folk music only has to be
Yep.
the hardanger fiddle, the old
Hmm.
guy playing at the
Hmm.
on the roof of his barn type cliche.
Yeah.
And it has been going on for many years, that you've
Hmm.
tried to do it with other instrumentations and so on since the 1970s. But
Hmm.
I think it was sort of the breakthrough finally was now, with
Hmm.
this new generation, that people have sort of fully sort of embraced that that the tent has become bigger, in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
The folk coalition has grown.
Yeah, I mean, and it's beautiful that it has, because that's how traditions stay alive, is if they adapt.
Yeah.
It's just, to me, there is something different when someone like Kenneth or Matthias, they do still come from the tradition
Mm.
before they start to change it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a there's a currency, or there is, I don't know. I think it matters to me, at the very least, that the people who are making the changes, the people who are trying to be progressive, are coming from within inside the
Mm.
house, so to speak.
Yeah.
To
For
me,
sure.
it just seems different when, and it what I will say is, it's especially different when the people who are making Nordic folk music are not even Scandinavian. Because to
Yeah.
me, if I see a Scandinavian doing something they call Nordic folk music, and I don't see it, I stay out of that conversation, because I'm American. I'm not going to tell Scandinavians what to do. I had that moment when I had the singer for the band Hindar Fjelon.
Oh
He
yeah,
told me that he considers his music Swedish folk music, and in my head, I'm like, you do? But the reason I didn't argue is I'm like, you're Swedish. That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do, right? So the bigger issue to me is when an American, for instance, makes Nordic folk music, and they make the argument where no, it has to change. Things can't stay the same. And to me, I think that's not really up to you if you're not in the folk music tradition. And this is where my more gatekeepy side does come out. But
yeah.
you do need gatekeeping to some degree, or else it's just total anarchy and chaos, and nothing means
For
anything.
sure,
Yeah.
for
So
sure.
do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, like I think the reason Swedish folk music almost got killed off by the accordion because the
Yep.
dance music was such a huge part of the Swedish countryside.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Sweden has been much more urban than Norway.
Mm-hmm.
So in Norway, you have these sort of off the grid places, whole sort of valleys
Mm-hmm.
where people sort of kept the traditions all the way up until this day, actually. And and you also have this. It's called Landskapsleiken.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's this yearly sort of. It's almost hard to explain. It's like the Eurovision Song Contest for Norwegian folk music in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you compete in folk music, and I think that is one of the things that has really managed to preserve the idea, because then you meet young and old, you meet multiple generations, and you sort of learn from each other, you play with each other, and it was a beautiful thing to see as well, because I hadn't been to the Landskap like before doing
Yep.
this show, and just such a respect for the music, but also for the nature. And I remember coming early the day after the big party, and it wasn't one piece of paper on the ground. No one had sort of dropped anything. It looked like there had been almost no people there. So everything was put in the trash cans, and like it's just such a reverence for nature, for culture, for the music. It really a strong sort of uh, um, environment
Mm-hmm.
to keep the traditional music going. So I think that is part of why it has been preserved so strongly in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
And it's absolutely right what you said about there was this band called Gåte
I
who
love Gotha.
uh, but if you talk to a person inside Norwegian folk music, they would say Gåte is not
Yep.
Norwegian folk music,
Yeah.
which is which is to me sort of narrowing it a little bit too much down, because they are using old Norwegian traditional songs from the
Yep.
like medieval ballads even. So
Mm-hmm.
it's but I think that had to do with they didn't come out of playing learning the traditional way. In the way they didn't
Yep.
compete, like in our episode with Matthias,
Mm-hmm.
he he won the Landskapleik
Mm-hmm.
competition in his sort of B class fiddle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he got into the A levels. That was
Congratulations, Matthias.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we were following him along. And then he went to Germany and he had this huge concert where he was lighting his fiddle on fire and playing
He's
the.
such an Elvis. He's
Yeah,
such a
yeah, yeah.
showman. I love it.
And that sort of is respected because he's done the work, he's done the homework, he's learned the songs, he's doing them sort of properly, and then he's sort of adding the bass and the drums and the
Mm-hmm.
guitar and the fireworks and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're absolutely right that that is sort of where you get the credit from in a way.
Yeah.
And he's learned it from like a guy like Knut Buen, who is now in his late 70s. I think he's one of those grand old men of Norwegian folk
Yeah,
music.
but
And
he's also always been very open to new things.
yeah,
He played with a death metal band like
yeah,
20 years ago or something like that. And
it's
I'm very
true.
fortunate. He was actually the very first Hardanger fiddler I ever listened to. So
Oh
I
wow,
got I got
yeah,
spoiled young because
yeah,
I went to the internet and just looked up Hardanger fiddle players. And this was like 15 years ago, and he was the first one that came up. And I bought his album called Quick as Fire. And
yeah.
and he was my introduction to the Hardanger fiddle. I'm like, what an introduction, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, and he's one of those legendary people.
Yep.
Uh, that there's so many stories related to him, and he also claims to bring it back to the supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
He claims to have seen a fiddler who lost control and went into a trance.
Yep.
They do believe that there were spirits involved, if it was
Mm-hmm.
trolls or Satan or whatever. But so he is part of that generation that still has that very sort of in touch with the old sort of spiritual sense of
Mm-hmm.
the world. And
Yeah.
a strange and funny story. The guy who played the fiddle at that time, and they had to cut the strings to make the Hardanger fiddle stop playing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, when we filmed the old guy in Setesdal, the off the grid place with Kenneth, we got to know that this guy had bought a fiddle from this really old, ancient type fiddler player. He had screwed it loose, and he had preserved the sweat that was inside the fiddle so that he could clone this old fiddle player if it came to it.
Oh, that is amazing.
So, so, so the DNA of this, and I can't remember now. He
Mhm.
was born in the 1800s, and he was really one of these last vestiges of growing up in the mountain cabins, no electricity, really believing that his grandmother was. I think I'm not gonna sort of speak ill of the dead, but that she had sort of magical powers in the
Yep.
realm of trolls or that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. So there still is these people around who has the heritage
Yeah, yeah.
connected to these old ideas about the supernatural.
Awesome. And I think this actually this brings me to maybe the last meaningful thing I have to say on this. The reason that I think this matters so much to talk about is because I don't know how familiar or inside the music scene you are around Varjuna and Heilung. I know you did the black metal documentary, which tells me that you absolutely are at least slightly interested. Um, there's a lot of this community defines itself by respecting old ways. A reverence for ancestors, a reverence for tradition, and all of this. And to me, there's something deeply ironic, if not hypocritical, to preach that kind of respect the old ways, respect what we lost over time, to modernization, but then turning around and completely disregarding what folk musicians have been through.
Mm,
The you especially you brought it up in Sweden, but in Norway too, the hostility towards traditional culture that can likely be dated back to this Viking age that this music community so heavily idolizes. Not the Hardanger fiddle, of course, that doesn't come around until the 1500s, 1600s.
mm,
But what I'm saying is that there's this irony, and I will say a hypocrisy, in preaching that kind of respect and love for old ways and heritage and tradition and ancestors, to then say, to completely, in a lot of ways, push out actual traditional culture and replacing it with something brand new that you just came up with,
mm.
and saying, well, it doesn't matter. There's just so much dissonance there to me
Yeah.
that, and the big problem is, if you say something isn't folk music, folk carries such a weight to it that that can come off as an insult. If
Mm,
I were to say something is not folk, people are like, what do you mean? What? I'm not saying it's not good. I'm saying it's not folk music.
mm.
And there's that conflation that happens between folk and good, right?
Yeah, for
But
sure.
that, at least to me, that is my little soapbox about why this conversation with this music style specifically is so important, is because it does betray a little bit of hypocrisy in the scene, to hold up Heilung and Vardruna on this pedestal as true Nordic folk music,
Mm.
while completely ignoring the struggles, the story, the oh, what do you call it? The pushback,
Yeah,
the friction that these musicians over centuries have fought against, to keep this tradition alive, back as far as possible. And
yeah,
that's, I guess, that's sort of the last thing I want to say on it. And if you have anything you want to say, I just at the very least think
yeah,
that's
yeah,
why
yeah,
this is
yeah,
an
yeah.
important conversation to have.
For sure, and I completely agree with you. And in Norway, my perception of it is partly it's been that the media has been so focused on making it rural,
Mm-hmm.
dressing them up in. There was one guy, I'll try to say it without sort of being non-politically correct, but he said that sometimes as a folk musician in the 70s, we felt like we were like these guys on the South Pacific Islands who were put into basta skirts and taking
Yep.
pictures, and they actually were wearing t-shirts and pants. You know the same thing with this, that there were people living in Oslo, in the capital, and they were sort of modern in
Mm-hmm.
every way, but they were taken into the rural areas, dressed up in a bunad,
Mm-hmm.
traditional sort of, and presented as this is the true look of the Norwegian folk music. And I
Yeah.
think people sort of grew a little bit, at least outside the milieu, they
Mm-hmm.
grew sort of a little bit skeptical because of the rapping in a way, that this was some sort of a national, it was brought out every time, the king was doing a speech, there was some guy with a hardanger fiddle there, that it sort of was given this, oh, a fiddler again. And
Mm-hmm.
it is, of course, difficult music as well to listen to, because you sort of have to get into it and work to understand, sort of the complexities, and it's tuned in this strange way, so it's not pleasing to the ear in the same way that a
Yep.
Mozart might be, or a Beethoven or classical music. So
Yep.
so I think all of those things played into it, and a strange thing as well was that when the National Socialists, when the Germans occupied Norway from 40 to 45, the
Yep.
National Socialists, the Quislings, used Norwegian folk music to say, this is, look at us, we're so Norwegian in a way.
Yeah.
And that strain sort of was put on it, and it was broken again in the 70s, where they managed to sort of reclaim,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I think, or maybe even before, but especially from that era, they
Mm-hmm.
managed to reclaim the idea of the folk music as, belonging to the people, and not sort of an historical negative in any way.
Yeah.
So it's complex in those ways, but I completely agree that, and I guess that's sort of human nature, that you feel the need to say I'm special and the other guys are sort of something else, or
Which
I
is
guess,
ironic because the Einar Selvik at every single Vardruna concert says exactly this. This is not a cultural pissing contest. This
yeah,
is not to say we're better, or this is just who we are. And
yeah,
where it doesn't make us better, or no one's, this ranking of what is a better ancestry to have. He makes this whole argument to these crowds, right?
yeah, 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 yeah,
Saying that this is not what this is supposed to be about. So stop trying to make it that.
yeah,
But then, of course, in one ear out the other with a lot of people, and
yeah.
the and you know the concrete results of this confusion between Nordic folk and Nordic folk is that my biggest problem is that is actually making it more difficult for people to learn about actual
Mm,
Nordic folk music.
yeah,
Because if you go to YouTube, if you go to Spotify, if you go to Google and you type in Nordic folk music, you don't get any Nordic folk music.
right,
I told
yeah,
Maria, because she was in Murkor's house, that Amalia is the first person to come up that is actually playing a Swedish folk tune.
wow,
When or no, it has to be Swedish.
yeah,
But you have to scroll a very long way to find it.
mm,
So that's the at least the one line of defense, right? But that is a very real consequence of this confusion between this Nordic folk and this Nordic folk, is now the actual stuff is getting filtered out and overwhelmed by this
Yeah.
music that is primarily MIDI samples, right?
Mm.
Of people who aren't even from Scandinavia. And that just really rubs me the wrong way. I just, if I have to be honest, and that's the sort of thing, that's sort of why it's worth speaking up for the stuff that's getting pushed down.
Yeah.
As this mainstream music, as a result of the video games and the movies, right, becomes the popular one, actual Nordic folk music is getting pushed out of the search engine, essentially. And I just think that that's not a good thing.
It's true. And I was at a Norwegian folk festival recently, and
Mm-hmm.
I did a talk about the series and showed some clips. And there was this Irish guy there, and he said, what you Norwegian folk musics, the traditional guys, don't do is to travel the way that, and packages the way that the Irish did.
Yep.
So Irish rebel songs is something that you might have, some sort of a, but if you say, oh, this is a Norwegian rebel song from when the Danes were occupying, people don't have any a clue. You know what I mean? Like, so he said, start moving into the world and start branding yourselves and being sort of clear about that you are Nordic folk music. Because
Mm-hmm.
it felt that so many of these amazing musicians were sort of staying at home in their valleys or their dales or,
That happens on this podcast.
oh, yeah?
The folk musicians, it was actually Matthias Thedens who was the one that told me we don't like leaving our bubbles.
Yeah.
We don't want to. And because when I did meet him for a beer in Oslo, I was telling him, I was like, dude, I am having a hell of a time getting folk musicians to come onto the Nordic Sound. Like, what do you think that's all about? And he said that doesn't surprise me at all. He said it's frustrating to him too, because he's very much in your line of thought that you need to get out, you need to advocate, you need to, be present, or else the people who are present are going to overshadow you.
Yeah.
Even if they're not actually genuine, they're the ones that are at least there. And, he gets frustrated because here I am, right? Like giving this completely open platform for musicians to talk about themselves and advocate for themselves, but they don't want to leave their bubble. And over time, it's getting better. I'm having more people who are taking me up on the offer, but I see what you're talking about happen as I try and program interviews.
Yeah.
The ones who respond to me are the Viking music guys.
Yeah.
They're the ones that respond to me every time. But then for every one folk musician who responds to me, 12 emails or 12 Instagram messages go left on red. Where, like,
Wow.
I don't think I'm so important that I need to be responded to. The reason I'm bringing this up is because that proves your point, that
Yeah.
I can email someone like Kjell Bråten, or I can email someone like Nils from Hindarfjell, and they respond to me and we have a great
Yeah.
conversation. And that's an opportunity that is missed for these folk musicians. And I'm just one opportunity. There are definitely more. But I get frustrated when I see that very same thing that you're talking about. Get out there,
Yeah.
talk, advocate for yourself, or else the people who are pretending to be like you are going to win because they're the ones who are being present. So your
Yeah.
point is very well taken.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. It might be for some of the guys a little bit of a language barrier that
Oh, I
it's
know. Yeah, yeah.
that it's scary to sort of do it in English because especially some of these amazing guys who are from the regional parts, they
Yeah, yeah.
sort of are in a bubble that's also a language bubble in a
Yeah, yeah.
way. So I think that might be a little bit of it, but I
Mm-hmm.
fully agree, and I know there has been a push now
Mm-hmm.
the last couple of years to get all these amazing artists more into the, if not mainstream, at least out into the world, because there is such a an opportunity, and some of these are brilliant artists, and
Yep.
mostly they play within their small region of Norway, like off the grid, off the grid, off the grid, off the grid. Like they play a community house in Tudal, which has like 55 people,
Mm-hmm.
over a huge span of forest, that you, that you
Yep.
so that is let's see what happens, because what I at least found with this is no matter what happens, the music is not going away. There
Yep.
will always be, if everything else is burning, there will be a guy called Boone or something like that, teaching the hard anger fiddle to the next generation.
Yep.
Even if everything is falling down around
Hmm.
him or her, there will
Yep.
still be, the sound
Hmm.
of the sort of Norwegian countryside. So that I think is, but for sure it should be more out there. And that was also a difficult thing when we did this fourth episode about going abroad. You
Hmm.
had a number of people with Ole Bull and some of these guys in the 1800s who went around and played, but then it dried up, and then you
Hmm.
had many decades where it almost didn't happen. And then now with Gangar and with some of these Olav Mjelva, there are a couple of people at least who are sort of looking abroad, but it has been too little for sure.
Yeah, I mean, just a little fun fact. Ole Bull's grandson, Storm Bull,
Yeah.
actually taught at the University of Colorado Boulder.
Wow.
So and
Wow.
and I work with he has his own archive here at CU, called just the Storm Bull Archive, where he has
Wow.
a whole bunch of letters, compositions. So the Bull family actually has a very strong footprint here in Colorado.
That's
So
fantastic.
it is really
I,
awesome.
I love it. And I went to the National Theatre
Hmm.
2 weeks ago and I saw Ragnhild Hemsing.
Yep.
She was playing on Ole Bull's hardanger fiddle while they were playing Henrik Ibsen's Peer Gynt. So she
Yep.
was in the Hall of the Man, like live as they were acting it out, and that was
Oh my God, that is so cool.
especially her on Ole Bull's fiddle was
Hmm.
amazing.
That is
Uh,
so cool.
it wasn't the best Peer Gynt I've seen, but it was so cool because of her. Like she nailed it.
Yep,
Uh,
she has that effect.
yeah,
Yeah, she's
so that
wonderful.
was. And
But
I'm
I
actually,
oh yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Please
I'm
continue.
actually working now on a new project with her
Hmm.
because people in Norway have seen this, so they want now to do sort of a troll tune with classical music. Uh,
Okay.
so I've been editing today a teaser for a new series about sort of this small school in Norway which has produced some of the major talent like Ragnhild Hemsing,
Hmm.
Alexander Rybak who did Fairy Tale. You have a number of these people who have gone to this musical institute,
Hmm.
which is one of the few private institutes in Norway that has been around for 100 years and
Hmm.
created all these amazing musicians. So we'll see how that goes. But I've been lucky there to meet Ragnhild and to
Yeah,
introduce some
yeah.
of the
Yeah, well,
people.
let me know if there's anything I could do to help with that classical music
Oh
one
yeah.
because that was where I started.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. My first degree was from a conservatory and I am like the Nordic classical music history
Oh
guy, one of
wow.
them.
Wow. Yeah.
I did a whole this podcast actually started as a classical music podcast where I just
Wow.
told the story of all the composers. Um, and my favorite one to do was Ole Bull, and Edvard
Yeah.
Grieg will forever be my absolute favorite composer of all time, especially because he was 100% a friend of the Trolls,
Yeah.
and he was unapologetic about it. But
Sure.
no, but maybe in the future I'll have you back on when that's done. I would love to,
Yeah.
but I think if we can end this on an uplifting note, I actually think that what you said was very beautiful, where um, everything could be burning down and there will still be a fiddler left teaching. And if we can reshape that to fit this conversation, I think as long as there's a waterfall, there will be a Fossagrim to teach those who come and seek it. So, Fredrik, as I
Yeah.
said, this has been my favorite podcast to do. In the 3 years I've been doing this, I've been having a hell of a time. And I am so deeply thankful to Ingrid for connecting us. So I guess before we wrap up here, if people want to learn more about you, if people want to see more of your stuff, just where could people find you? Where could people follow you? This is usually how I end it when I'm talking to musicians. I just don't know if
Yeah.
screenwriters
No,
have something similar.
Well, no, I have a couple of films that's still on Netflix and all
Mhm.
that stuff, but I don't know if I have that kind of, one thing to plug, like go
Yeah, yeah.
find uh, Fredrik.com or something. I don't. So no, but it would be so good if we could do a translated version of Trolltune so that you could be able to see it and all that stuff. So
Mhm,
maybe now with artificial intelligence, there could be a way that it
mhm.
could be done easily so that I don't have to sit and type everything out because that's,
Maybe maybe I would be receptive to AI if it's being used for the good like that. If it's being
yeah,
used to translate something into more languages, and then someone gives it a once over to make sure it didn't say anything ridiculous, I think that's a very healthy use of AI. If it makes
yeah.
knowledge more accessible to people.
The
Yeah.
the one strange thing, I'm talking so much now, but the one
No,
strange
please.
with AI was we were doing the editing for the show,
Yeah.
and the AI sound music sort of program thought that the hard anger fiddle was speaking. So it translated it into sort of a speaking voice.
Maybe it
So
was.
yeah, so I've heard the voice of the hard anger fiddle speaking through AI. So that's
It's
that's
the
the one thing.
trolls.
It's the trolls. It was the trolls in the computer for
Oh,
sure.
that's amazing. Well, Fredrik, thank you so much for coming on the
Thank
Nordic
you so much.
Sound. It's always so worth it to me to have non-conventional guests on here, because the conversation is just so refreshing. And I do seriously thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and sort of not only pitch this documentary, but to also let people in on it, on what it was like making it. So seriously, thank you for coming on to the Nordic Sound. I'll have you back on next time when you've done that next one on the classical music. Sound good?
Thank you so much.
All
Yeah.
right, cool. Hang around after I stop the recording. But for the listeners, see you soon. All right.